Anyway, so thank you so much for coming today. This is our last session together. My name is Sitao Wafula. I'm from Kenya, and for the last 2 and now 3 weeks, I've been talking about African women theologians. I see some new faces. Welcome. Just to let you know what we've been covering. On Sunday the 7th, we started with an introduction of the theology of African women. And we started by looking at the geographical and historical setting. Then last week, we dived into, we also talked about religions first Sunday together. And then last Sunday, we looked at theology and theologians. And today we're going to put all of those things together, and I forgot to bring sticky notes. I'll do that in a bit. And we will be having more group work, more or less what we did the past Sunday when we, in our tables, discussed African countries and African cities and religion. So we'll do some sort of group work. Just as a... Okay, today, we'll do group work. It's looking at application. And the question we'll be asking ourselves today is, how can this theology inform our everyday lives? So that's what we'll be asking ourselves today. As you know, besides learning about theology, I'm trying to make you all masters of Swahili. And so I've been sneaking in a couple of prayers and things Swahili related. And today I'll be doing the blessing that Aaron did, which is found in the book of Numbers, and I'll do it in Swahili. It's a blessing, and I want to leave you with those blessings. So I'm bestowing Aaron on myself and giving you blessings. And that's what I'll do today in Swahili. And then a brief recap of last week and look at the gains, which we didn't look at last week. And last but not least, now we'll get into the reflections and group work. So hesabu means to count or numbers. That's Swahili. So the book of Numbers, kitabu is book. So Kitabu cha Hesabu is the book of Numbers, and we'll be looking at chapter 6 chapter 6, verse 24 to 26, and you can follow, as usual, English at the bottom, Swahili at the top. Okay, so Bwana akubariki na kulinde. Bwana akuangazie nuru za uso wake na kufadhili. Bwana akuinulie uso wake na kukupa amani. So that's the Aaron blessing. So, Amina. So recap last week, we looked at African theologies. We looked at the Black liberation theology, and we talked about Black Americans here in the US and Black South Africans in South Africa. We also talked about both African theology and African women's theology, and just looked at the connections between Christianity and those two theologies. And then post-colonial Africa and looking at what religion and theology looks at that time. We then moved to African women. That's meant to be theology. I see the typo now. So we looked at the lady who founded it and a couple of other ladies. And then we also looked at the interreligious collaborations. You all remember the story of the Liberian women? Please put that story into context and don't say the naked parts. We didn't come last week, please. Talk to your neighbor. So, and then I also kept showing a couple of publications that the women have done. That was last week. Today, I just want to finish this slide. We didn't get to it last week. I think also engrossed in storytelling. And so some of the gains that the African women theologians have been able to make are mentorship and enrollment to theology schools. So there are more women going to theology schools because of the work that they've done, more women being mentored on how to write and publish. So those are some of the gains that I've made. There are hundreds of books, and I showed a couple of books last week, and that's not even half or even a quarter of the books that I've done. So they've had hundreds of books and journal articles. And then if you go to Ghana, there's a center for women, religion, and culture. So putting all those concepts and things we've been talking about together. And there's a resource center in Limuru in Kenya, where I'm from. And then the challenge that they face is it's still seen as a women's thing. So yes, it's African women's theology, but in a lot of circles, they just say, oh, women making noise about women things. So that's one of the challenges. And then distributing publications. I would say, how many of you have seen any of the books I mentioned before I mentioned them? So that's another challenge that they face. How do they distribute the work that they produce? Also, another thing is citations. For those of you who write papers, you have to cite. How many of you cite people from Africa? Okay, thank you. You're a professor. So yeah, so that's the other thing. Or even speakers, or even when you watch things and give an example, so how many of you cite those things? So those are some of the challenges they face, and both within the continent and also globally. So that's something, if you see any of the articles or the books that I mentioned that looks interesting, worth diving into, get a copy, cite it, mention it, have it as part of your book club or something, so that you're also learning, but you're also helping them distribute their work. Good. So that's last week. So I'm going to teach you a new term or ideology. It's from Ghana. It's Sankofa. Sankofa is this bird here. And it's a bird that's going forward, but its head, I'm not that flexible, but you get what I'm trying to do. So it does that thing. And it means to go back and get it. In Swahili, we say, Mwachamila ni mtumwa. Those people who leave their customs or their roots become like slaves of the places or the customs or the roots that they follow. And it's almost like if you don't have your own ideologies or your own understanding of things, any ideology or any understanding just carries you away. And so with this Sakofa, going back is almost like what we do at the end of the year. We sit down and go back and look at how we did that year, see what are some of the things we did well. We get them and we celebrate those things. So I'm going to use that for today. So I want us to go back to our 2 weeks together and get some of the things that we've been able to learn these past 2 weeks. And also, that's the Swahili thing I said. Mwacha mila ni mtumwa. Mwacha is to live, mila is culture. Mtumwa is like a servant or a slave. In Swahili, I mean. So, and that was the theme for this year's circle, which happened like 2 or so weeks ago. They have these meetings every 5 years. And so the last meeting that they had a couple of weeks ago, that was the theme. And I want us to carry that theme with us as we get into reflection. So these are the 3 main questions that we'll be going through. I'll leave them on the screen, but I just want to go through them. So first I'll do 2 Bible readings, and they relate to one body, many members. Because we are all part of one body, the body of Christ, but we're different members. We have different cultures, different understanding. And I've taught you a new body part you didn't know, maybe some of you didn't know existed, and that's the African women theology. And so that's sort of the thinking that I want us to get into the next session of group discussions with. And then we'll watch a TED Talk. Share this TED. It's not my TED Talk. I hope you watched me. I have a TED Talk. So it's not it's by a lady from Nigeria. She's one of the best current authors from Africa. Her books, her work is top notch. We need another session out of school for today. Yeah. So we watch that TED Talk, and then as you watch it, remember what we've learned for the last 2 weeks. What she's saying, your context as people who are based here in America, and ask yourself, she talks about the single story. So the first question, and these questions will be here, that you need to start thinking about is, what was your single story before the sessions? So before we started and you had, we're coming to learn about African women theologians, what are some of the things that you had in mind? And then the second question is, what's the other side? So you had one sort of thinking, and then what's now the other side? What's the add-on that you got? So what's the other side of the story or narratives that you're taking away from this? And in short, what did you learn? And connected to this, how can these learnings, the things that you've learned, be applied to your life and your community here at St. James, in Lancaster, in the US, and as a global citizen? You may not think of yourself as such, but we are all global citizens because we are all parts of the world. And then the last question is, what do you wish you learned? Or feedback. This is where you tell me how good it was. So we'll go through these questions and you'll show them in your groups. I'll bring pens and sticky notes as you watch the TED Talk, but we'll start with the Bible reading, and I won't read all of it, but this is from 1 Corinthians. Just as a body, though one has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. And I want to jump to 18. But in fact, God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. If there were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. And related to that is the book of Romans 12. Again, won't read all of it, but maybe just the beginning. For just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we, though many, form one body, each member belongs to all the others. The first Sunday I talked about Ubuntu. I am because you are. So we are all part of each other. Ubuntu is a South African philosophy. So if I'm not teaching you Swahili, I'm teaching you African philosophies and ideologies. So Ubuntu is I am because we are. So we are part of each other. And that's reflected by these two verses. So I want you to have what we learned in the last 2 weeks, these two verses, the TED Talk we'll watch, and then we'll use that for our group work. Good? Mm-hmm. I'm sort of rushing so that we have more time for group work and discussions. So I will go to a TED Talk, which I hope.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in Eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably closest to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil, and illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I knew exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They lived in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how the mountain was the sun that comes.
Very American things.
That I lived in Nigeria. I never been outside Nigeria. We took up snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British shows I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And many years afterwards, I remember the desperate desire to taste ginger beer. And I thought, what is the other thing that is? It's how individual and vulnerable we are in the face of the story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books by their very nature had to have a foreign spin and had to be able to which I But things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and we were quite easy to find as foreign books. But because of writers like Sean and I went through the mental perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin with a lot of traditions, thinking a lot of form details, would also exist in literature. I started to write about things that I recognized. Now, I loved those American English books I read. They stirred my imagination, but opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So the discovery of African writers particularly was this: it saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had the door. Living in Mexico, from nearby villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Hugh. But one thing that I told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like today's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous for today's family. And one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family would actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but. I'm having I use this room as my office, but the desk is over here. And so
I'm walking with you too.
That's the background. I have my therapy session, which just for that poverty was my single story of that. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called tribal music. I was consequently very disappointed when I pitched my team about it. She had seen that I did not know how to use the stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her, no possibility of text, no possibility of connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to the US as a new identity, and I remember once I think of myself now as African. Although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country. The most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement of the marriage flight from there showing to work in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa, I still think And Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and illness, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreign. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's Bible. This simple story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the Black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what's important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of self-denying Africans of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poets, were just dreaming, and half dead, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this simple story. I was had a professor who once told me that my novel was not meant to be African. Now, I was quite relieved to that text that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of cases. But I had not quite imagined that it had failed and achieved something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I too just assumed a question of single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were facing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the point of sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up together in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind and actually saying that. I wanted to the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that's what they become. It is impossible to talk about a single story without talking about power. There is a word and a word that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is carrying Islam that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of Nkali. How they are told, who tells them, where they are told, how many stories are told, and reason independence on power. However, it's not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian theory balance writes, if you want to disinfluence the people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and start with second. Start the story with the areas of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British. Start the story with the theory of the African states and not with the colonial creator of the African state. I have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, And like it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. No. Obviously, I said this in my interpretation. It would never have occurred to me to say that just because they had written off which character was a serial killer, but it was somehow representative of all Americans. And this is not because of the but because of America's cultural and economic power, there are many stories of America. They're talking about all time that started and not just the story of America.
Why open your car door while still crashed underground? A fatal construction flaw in all recent automobiles.
When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my two special people died in a plane crash because a fire truck did not abort. And I grew up under a responsibility so that the team had made a huge so that sometimes my parents will not pay their assistance. And so the time, I thought, so I breakfast seat. And then I came to see it. And this is all a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. But it's histories. It's to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that shout me. The single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become a whole story. Of course, Africa and everyone is very well over the time. The negative one, such as the depressing one, such as the fact that 5,000 people are fighting for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not a catastrophe. And it's very important, it's just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with the case or the person without engaging with all of the stories of that case. The consequence of a single story is that it robs people of dignity. It is a recognition of an evil humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we see. So, before my next country, I had followed the English of both sides, the US and the Mexican. What if my mother had told us that Fide's family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcasts diverse African stories all over the world, what the Nigerian writers Nigerian calls an abundance of stories? What if my roommate knew about my Nigerian publisher, a remarkable man who left his job in a bank to follow his dream and start a publishing house? Now, the conventional wisdom is that Nigerians don't read literature. He disagreed. He felt that the people who could read would read if you made literature affordable and available to them. Shortly after he published my first novel, I went to the TV station in Lagos to write, and the woman who was there as a messenger came up to me and said, I came to that novel. I said, like anything. I must write a sequel, and this is what will happen. What's right in the sequel? I was not only charmed, I was very moved. Here was a woman, part of the ordinary masses of Nigerians who are not supposed to be readers. She had not only read the book, but she had taken ownership of it and felt justified telling me who wants to write a sequel. Now, if my roommates knew about my friend, Fumi Yonda, a fearless woman who hosts a TV show in Lagos and is determined to tell the stories of her friends to forget. What if my roommate knew about the happy studio that was performed in the Lagos hospital last week? What if my roommate knew about contemporary Nigerian music, talented people singing in English education and Igbo and Yoruba and Ijaw mixing influences from Chelsea to Fedard or Marley to their grandfathers. What if my roommate knew about the female lawyer who recently went to court in Nigeria to challenge a ridiculous law that would allow government to get their husbands for renewing their passports? What if my roommate knew about Hollywood, full of innovative people making films despite great technical honors? Films so popular that they really are the best example of lecturers consuming what they produce. What if my roommate knew about my wonderfully ambitious head grader who was just started a business selling hair extensions? What about the millions of engineers who start businesses and sometimes fail but continue to nurse ambition? Every time I hold my confronted with the usual sources of irritation of most Nigerians, our failed infrastructure and the label government, but also by the incredible resilience of people who could thrive despite the government rather than because of it. I teach writing workshops in Lagos every summer, and it is amazing to me how many people apply, how many people are eager to write, to tell stories. My Nigerian publisher and I have just started one of its called for Theologians. We have many things of my libraries, and it's not just my libraries in other places. I also organize lots of workshops people like this students master, many students master. Students have been used to this maximum line. But stories can also be used to empower as humans. Stories can break the dignity of the people, but stories can also repair that dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about asylum relatives who moved to the north, and she introduced them to a book about the southern life of the They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and the kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.
Good. I was love listening to Chimamanda. Look for her books. She has another TED Talk. She's done many. She has another TED Talk. She's done many speaking engagements. If you Google her, you'll get a lot of her work. But now this is what we are going to discuss. So just think about what she said about the single story and the dangers of the single story and the beauty of their side of the story. And think about what we've learned in the last 2 weeks and also the Bible readings about us being part of one body, and ask yourself, what was the single story you had before these sessions? And then what's the other side of the story or other narratives that you've learned because of these sessions? And how do you see yourselves applying those things in your own life and your community life here in Lancaster, here at St. James and the US? And then last but not least, what do you wish you'd have learned? So think about those things. I'm rushing to get sticky notes, and then you can start discussing in your groups. Good? So before we get feedback from the groups, I just want to do a recap of the series. We started with Africa. We looked at the geographical and historical settings. We looked at the empires and the kingdom, colonization, and post-colonial Africa. And I think that's the first session. We talked about how we ask questions and who is the story serving. And as Chimamanda has mentioned, the word secondly. So if we start a story with secondly, how different that story is from if we started with that person first. And then We also looked at African religions. We talked about how Africa is not homogeneous. We have over 3,000 tribes, all with different cultures, religions, and all those religions have different theologies. So we talked about religion being part of African culture and way of life, and we looked at that quote from John Beatty, where he talked about Africans carrying their religion everywhere they go, including their party. Remember that quote? Yeah. And then we also talked about the creation story and supreme creator. We looked at the story of Guy, the Kikuyu in Kenya, and religion being communal. We looked at Ubuntu, Harambee, and Ujamaa, all ideologies, principles of doing things not for the individual, but for the communities. And then last week, we looked at African theologies, looked at them as more of experience and active being as opposed to things set on stone. We looked at liberation theology. We looked at African theology. Remember the Whiter Snow example? And she also talked about snow. Looks like we have a problem with snow. And then also the two wings, that's the women's theology, where a bird cannot fly with one wing. We talked about last week. And then reconstruction. And then we also talked about the ladies who sort of came together to form the African Women Theologians, the birth attendants, and how they all got together. Today we've looked at gains and challenges. Just want to recap on themes and perspectives: interdenominational, interreligious. You'll never forget what those women did, right?
Yeah.
So, and then oral and narrative theology is all about stories. I showed a picture of my grandmother. And so that's all we've learned in the past 2 weeks. It's been an amazing session. And now I throw it back to you. Takeaways and feedback. We'll start with question number 1. We'll start there. Just read through or summarize. What was the single story you had before the session?
Number one. Number one, we talked about people who had a neighbor who was African. Paul wanted to know more about the heritage, the theology, the communal nature of the epidemic, how they saw the gospel, and what is the humanity of the African person, and liberation. Disappointed that they didn't hear more about liberation theology.
We missed session 2, so. We missed session 2, so check your notes.
This table, number 1.
So for the first question, we had thought the presentation was like just going to be focused on like more religion or like just focused more on family. But we saw how like the religious identity, the gender, culture, politics all kind of fit together.
Okay. Jan?
There are thoughts with regard to the preconceived notion of what Africa is in terms of what the limitations had been with the single story that had been presented to us as we grew up. And then the openness to receive a new presentation as to what women in theology would be, because that traditionally has not been something that had been articulated as we listen to stories and being fully aware of that difference. I think that I'm just going to go on to say that there was a metaphor that was used by Charity, which I think is great. And she used it, are we going to be a melting pot or a salad? And I think what was very impressive to me when I think about Black women really forging through theology to combat the differences and to be a powerhouse, to then say, how do we maintain and retain that ancestry that was so important, the oral traditions, so that it not be diluted by the colonial influences, to maintain who you are, but at the same time understand that we have a loving God that includes all of us. And so we can all be different, in the bodies that we have, the clothes that we wear. And I think it's important for Africans to hold on to that. Sorry, but you got me going.
Yeah. I had the girls. I just want to hear voices from the other groups. But I think we need a part two. How many agree?
A
part two of this.
Part two.
Okay.
3, 4, 5.
Okay. I'm sorry the time is short, but let's have this table just share number one, share number one, share number one.
Like number one, I'm not the most articulate person. I was the one who was doing all the talking here. But we talked about a single story, and we were fortunate in this table to have some people who will know more than a single story of Africa. But as a professor, has been to Africa many times. If there's something that I would never have thought of, that from an African point of view, Jesus was being sought after by Herod to be killed. He went to Egypt, and Egypt was a place of refuge for Jesus. And that's a story that I had never considered before. That a safe place that he would go to when he was being persecuted by his own people. So it had a very interesting point of view. I have another story I can tell about that. I'm sorry,
I'll cut you short. I just want to, and I'm sorry, it's just time. My hands are cut.
I think for me it was women, because a lot of the church context I heard from has been more evangelical with male African pastors. And so to hear the power of women and the sort of, and also just the birth at the vote. Like the idea of what are people helping something be born and having the courage to say, what can I help be born in this moment in my world?
The book.
Okay, so I know we're kind of wrapping up on time here. I think kind of the one major single story that we had before the sessions was, I guess, kind of this idea of what was authentically African. And we kind of thought that there was like a little bit more unity across the continent, but and I think only one of us had been here for all three sessions, but even from this session alone, we kind of figured out that there's just a lot of diversity amongst the continent.
I would love to hear everything that you wrote down. So if you don't mind, I'd like to get your papers. You can write me a love note in there. But I'd like to collect all the information that you have. And I'm very grateful. I'm sorry time is not on our side, especially for people who have to go for the second service. But thank you for coming. Thank you for coming.